This is Philosophy Bites with me, David Edmonds.
And me, Nigel Warburton.
Philosophy Bites is available at www.philosophybites.com.
Philosophy Bites is made in association with the Institute of Philosophy.
Is utopianism necessarily unrealistic? Is it just wishful thinking? Some political philosophers draw a distinction between realism in political theory, with its aim of exposing politics as it actually is, and utopianism, which offers a vision for how political arrangements could be. Raymond Geuss of Cambridge University says it's perfectly possible to be a realist utopian.
Raymond Geuss, welcome to Philosophy Bites.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Good morning.
The topic we're going to focus on today is realism in political philosophy. I wonder if you could start by just saying what realism means in this context.
It seems to me there are at least three different senses in which the term realism is used. There's a strictly philosophical sense in which it's used, in which it designates either something metaphysical or something epistemological. It means either that we see things directly, that's a kind of epistemological realism, or it means that universals really exist, that's Platonic realism, or it means something like that. There's a second sense of realism, which is realism as used in international affairs. There, realism in general tends to mean that if you want to understand how nations act, they act only on their own interests, and they act on those interests in the narrowest possible way, and they act so as to increase their power and their ability to get those interests, and everything else is window dressing. Realism in political philosophy doesn't mean either of those two things. It means a third sort of thing. It means the attempt not to be deceived, the attempt not to engage in wishful thinking about the world, to see the world as it is.
Do you think that wishful thinking then is part of the human condition?
Yes, I think in fact, if you look at human beings as we're now constituted, a lot of our life is devoted to trying to make ourselves feel good about ourselves, to presenting a positive image of ourselves both to others and to ourselves. No one particularly likes to think of themselves as morally deficient or as nasty, and so I think that's a very, very strong human motivation, and in a way, it's a perfectly understandable and a good human motivation. There's something very good about that we don't want to simply say, yes, I'm a nasty person, do something about it. So it's a deeply, deeply rooted human structure, both in individuals, if I might say, and in larger groups too. No nation wants to see itself as being horrible.
So could you give an example of how wishful thinking enters into the political realm?
Well, if you think, for example, about the way in which high-minded moral descriptions of various political activities are given. Obviously, the war in Iraq was not fought in order to bring democracy and freedom to the people of Iraq. It was fought for completely different, and it seems to me significantly more reprehensible reasons. But you don't get people standing up and saying, well, yes, we're going to attack Iraq in order that it be eradicated from the chessboard in the Middle East so that we can pursue our own geopolitical projects there. You hear them saying, well, we're, of course, in favor of democracy and freedom.
So a good kind of political realism would reveal the wishful thinking that's within that style of thinking.
I think that realism in politics should have a number of different aims. One of them, of course, should be to try to lay bare the kinds of lies that we tell to ourselves and we tell to others about our own action. There's a second important function of realism, though, which is not just to uncover structures of wishful thinking, but to uncover what used to be called ideological structures. Now, ideological structures are slightly different from structures of wishful thinking, in that in the case of wishful thinking, I think something because I want it to be the case, in general because I want it to be the case because it reflects well on me. In the case of an ideology, at least in the traditional sense of the term ideology, I don't believe in the ideology because the ideology conforms with a wish I have about myself. If a member of the proletariat in the 19th century believed in the ideology of laissez-faire, the ideology of laissez-faire supported the interests of the capitalist class, not the interests of the proletariat. So ideology is a slightly different kind of deception that people are subject to. So the first thing a realist political philosophy should do is to help us deal with wishful thinking. And the second thing it should do is to try to lay bare the structure of ideological forms of thinking.
I'm intrigued by this problem of ideology because it seems to me that the people who lay bare the ideological thinking, if they believe in the structure of ideology, must themselves be in the grip of some further ideology.
Well, ideology doesn't have to have the kind of universal use that you take it to have in that. In general, I think philosophy is much better off if we focus on the narrow kinds of deviations from rationality that we find, rather than having great global theories about how things ought to be. So I don't think that there is, as it were, some global phenomenon, which is the phenomenon of total ideological illusion. I think ideologies are very specific, very particular, and you can analyze them in detail, showing how they're internally flawed, and you can do that without making larger epistemological claims.
So what you're saying is that although some people and classes of people, groups of people can be completely structured in their thought by the economic situation they find themselves within, other people can stand outside that and commentate on it without themselves being trapped in that world of socioeconomic relations that somehow pollutes their thinking.
It's interesting that you say there can be completely caught up in these ideological illusions, because that's part of one of the traditional conceptions of ideology, but I don't share that. I don't think that an ideological illusion is best understood as a great global network which encompasses everyone and from which no one can escape. I think of it as a rather local phenomenon that can be analyzed, can be internally analyzed, its internal deficiencies can be exhibited, without it necessarily being the case that one makes large epistemological claims about one's own purity of intention or purity of point of view.
We've talked about wishful thinking and about ideology. Are those the only two ways in which people get caught up in structures of thinking that somehow prevents them seeing things as they are?
There is actually a third strand of realism which one associates nowadays with Foucault and with Nietzsche, which is sometimes called genealogy. A genealogy is supposed to be a way of thinking about certain identities that exist in the contemporary world. So, for example, Foucault thought there was an identity of the delinquent, the homosexual, the frigid woman. These were identities. And to say they were identities meant they were mental constructions that had a kind of reality. They presented themselves as if they were ways of putting together things that naturally belong together. So the homosexual was naturally A and B and C, and those three things formed a natural unit. And a genealogical account was supposed to break down the illusion of obviousness of that connection. It was an attempt to show that historically those elements, A and B and C, had nothing to do with one another. They came together as a result of contingent historical and political forces, and the appearance of unity and the appearance of naturalness of these units was nothing but an illusion. And so a realistic political philosophy would have to try to break down some of those apparently obvious identities too.
So to take your example of the homosexual, what would be the sorts of things that would be B and C? Obviously A is going to be attraction to the same sex, but what are the other sorts of things that might fall into those categories?
Well, that's a complicated question. Now, the standard analysis that Foucault does refers really to the 50s and 60s, and these are conceptions that we don't actually share anymore. But I mean, there might be some conceptions about people being effeminate, about them being interested in the arts. There'll be any number of about other aspects of the structure of their desire. There might be various sorts of things that people would put together and think went together naturally with this underlying disposition to be, for example, a homosexual or to engage in homosexual activities, or however you want to describe it.
So what Foucault did was look at how people arrived at that conception of a homosexual or some other category of ways of being, and by showing the history, the causal history, eliminated any sense that this grouping of certain characteristics is somehow inevitable.
Yes, exactly. That's the point of his analysis of sexual behavior in the ancient world. As you know, the Thebans in the ancient world had a special military band, which was called the Sacred Band, which was groups of homosexual partners who fought together and formed a particular elite military group. Now, if you just know historically that something like that exists, it's very, very difficult then to continue to think that people who have homoerotic desires necessarily are unwarlike.
So that sounds quite reasonable. Why shouldn't a diagnosis of that kind eliminate illusion?
Well, illusions don't generally stand in the world in a merely cognitive context. They arise because they serve certain needs that people have, and they're connected with powerful social institutions. So I wouldn't want to say that a realist political philosophy that has these three aspects necessarily in itself would do away with discrimination or do away with prejudices people might have, because it would have also to analyze the origins of these in particular social institutions, and simply by analyzing the way they arose in institutions, you wouldn't necessarily get rid of the institution.
Oh, I see. So this is more a descriptive account of the status quo than the kind of thing that's going to get people, politically active.
Well, it will get people on the battlefield and get them politically active if they have an interest in changing things. It isn't the case that you can generate in people from nothing a motivation to do anything. For them to do anything, they have to be motivated to do it. And part of this would be to appeal to certain kinds of motivations that people might have. For example, if people who were gay were perfectly happy with these identities, then what would be the point? No one would have any interest in changing that. I mean, the assumption of this is that there is a potential for change, and people feel oppressed by these things. A realist political philosophy is an attempt to be an instrument in helping those people in those circumstances to deal with the oppression they feel themselves to be under, or the need they feel to be different, to change.
Another way of putting this might be wishful thinking isn't enough. Ideology and the elimination of ideology isn't going to change everything, nor is an assessment of genealogy. So what do we do? What is the realism that's left once you've recognised that these are ways in which we can fail to have a realistic view of the political situation?
I'm not in the game of predicting or being a prophet or wanting to tell anyone else how to act or to live. But I think there are two poles. There's a pole of realism and there's a pole of utopianism. There's a pole which tells you don't be a victim of wishful thinking, don't be a victim of ideological illusion, don't be a victim of various kinds of repressive identities. And then there's another pole, which is the pole of cultivating what you want and finding out what you want and taking your desires seriously and trying to clarify them, even if they're utopian in their content, even if they can't be satisfied in the life in which we lead. And it seems to me that both of those things are important parts of it. So I wouldn't say that realism covers everything in political philosophy. I think a political philosophy has to be both fully realistic and fully utopian.
So utopianism isn't wishful thinking, it's something different from that?
Well, of course, it's perfectly reasonable for me to say you shouldn't engage in wishful thinking. It doesn't follow from that I think that you shouldn't wish for anything. There's nothing wrong with wishing for things, and there's nothing wrong with wishing for things that are not compatible with the continued maintenance of the present form of society. I'm interested in criticizing the unclear confusion between what is really the case and what ought to be the case. I don't mean to say that every form of utopianism is good. That would be a very, very foolish position to take. All I'm saying is that from the fact that one wants to have a basically realistic political theory, that is, that one wants people to see their present situation clearly, it in no way follows that one doesn't also think that it's important for human beings to find out what they really want and to find out what we want together and to clarify and develop projects for how we might actually implement that, even if those projects are projects that require very, very drastic reconstruction of the kind of society in which we live. That's the kind of utopianism I'm in favor of.
We've been talking about these three things: wishful thinking, ideology, and genealogy. Is this a kind of discussion that can actually impact on real lives? Or is it the wheel spinning free, as it were? So we're just talking about politics?
Well, in a way, of course, we are talking about politics because we are talking about politics. But in another sense, of course, talking about politics is doing politics. Much of politics is talking about politics. That's what parliaments, that's what councils, that's what elections are all about. So in a way, I don't really want to accept that distinction. I want to say that by presenting theories, we're also always intervening in a particular discussion. So there are two mistakes one can make. One mistake is to think that just saying things will do more than it actually can do. That is, just by saying things and analyzing errors, you'll get rid of them. That's wrong. But it's also wrong to think that just saying things is just saying things. In saying something, I'm doing something, I'm intervening. By saying this, I'm trying to change the minds of various sorts of people, and that is a political intervention. And the difficult thing is to get the balance of both of those things right.
Raymond Geuss, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
And you can hear more Philosophy Bites at www.philosophybites.com.
Philosophy Bites is made in association with the Institute of Philosophy. For more information about the Institute, go to www.philosophy.sas.ac.uk.